Good afternoon, everybody. It's my third time in Riga. It's a pleasure to be back. Hearing the presentations this morning, it really strikes me how similar Riga and Rotterdam actually are. Both very historic cities where over the course of time, the port has moved away from the city center towards the sea. And also both cities that are both ports are also important transit points, not only for their home markets, but also for markets further inland. This morning, I will provide, this afternoon, sorry, I will provide a presentation about general trends in port development with a focus on some of the initiatives we have taken in Rotterdam to redevelop older parts of the port. So general trends, we have, I think if you look at the theme of port development, you can see four categories. The first is a bigger scale. So what we have seen, especially in the last 20, 30 years, are bigger ships, bigger volumes of cargo. This, of course, has an impact on the kind of infrastructure that port authorities and governments have to invest in. These vessels need deeper water. You need different kinds of quay walls. You need more space. Another important trend is energy transition and circular economy. Many ports, Rotterdam being a prime example, grew on industry, heavy industry. Coal-fired power plants, refineries, chemical plants. But of course, we know that we are slowly, especially in Europe, we are shifting away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies. In Rotterdam, we expect that maybe in the next 30 to 50 years, at least one of the refineries in our port might close. There's already pressure to close some of the coal-fired power plants we have in the port. So now ports need to adjust to these changes and to find new industries revolving around not only new sources of energy, but also the circular economy, recycling of materials. Another important trend is quality of life. People want nicer waterfront access. They want to be able to, they want cleaner air, less noise. So this also has an impact on how ports are planned. A fourth aspect, which has less to do with hard infrastructure and more with softer aspects, management, is port governance. The changes that, these trends are all interrelated. And as ports and find new ways to deal with these changes, you also see that changes in the way ports are managed. In some cases, you are seeing nearby ports merging with each other under one company. In some cases, you are seeing changes in the business model of the Port Authority from being a government agency, an administrative agency, to a corporate entity. So I will briefly give you some examples of all this. So movement away from the city centers. You see this in all parts of the world. I give you only 3 examples here, but this can also be seen in parts of Africa, Latin America. Rotterdam, as I mentioned before, we started here, and slowly we have moved to the North Sea. I will talk more about this in later slides. If we look at Singapore, you see a similar trend. The Port of Singapore began 200 years ago here in the city center. Then it moved to Keppel Harbor, then Pasir Panjang, then Jurong. And now the Singaporean government is developing this new area called Tuas, because Keppel Harbor, within the next 10 years, all the activities here will be shifted here. And by 2040, Pasir Panjang, which is here, will also be shifted to Tuas. So also there you are seeing that even in Singapore, the port activities are all being clustered, concentrated here in the western part of Singapore. This is where you have a lot of industries, refineries, power plants, and the government is focusing on turning this area more for urban leisure purposes and clustering everything on the western side of the country. A third example, an example that I'm very familiar with because I lived in Korea for many years, is the port of Busan. Busan also started here in the city center, and you can see that we're talking small plots of land, very dense urban environment, mountains. Busan is one of the biggest ports in Northeast Asia. It has grown very fast. So in the mid-90s, the Korean government invested in this new port called Busan New Port. And some of these older areas of the city, especially this one here, is being converted into leisure, urban waterfront. So you can see a common, and Riga is no exception. If we look at Riga, especially the presentations of this morning, we also saw the same trend moving away from small areas near the city center towards bigger areas with deeper water. I think the development of Kunsinsala and Krivussala, for example, is an example of that trend here in Riga. So I think you see this is very much a global trend. On the topic of port governance, this is also a very interesting topic. In Europe, we are seeing nearby ports increasingly coming under the same management. So I give a couple of examples here. Copenhagen and Malmö. Copenhagen is in Denmark, Malmö is in Sweden. Sometime in the 1990s, when the Øresund Bridge was opened, both ports faced a threat to their business model because they relied on ferry services, which were going to go away once the bridge opened. So to survive, these two ports actually merged under a company called CMP. And since then, the two ports have done very well. In Rotterdam, we have our own example, where in 2014, we acquired the port of Dordrecht, which I will discuss in more detail later. A more recent example from last year, the Dutch ports of Vlissingen and Terneuzen merged with the Belgian port of Ghent, because these three ports share the same access to the sea. They also face the same competition. So to become more commercially competitive, they decided to merge under one entity called North Sea Port. You also see the same trend in Italy. Italy is reducing the number of port authorities, bringing smaller ports under one entity. And also one of the biggest ports in the Mediterranean, Valencia, actually consists of three separate ports, Valencia, Sagunto, and Gandia. And the advantage of merging ports is that sometimes you create economies of scale, because the ports can use the same services or equipment, but also for the government, it makes it easier to prioritize investments, especially in hinterland infrastructure. Okay. Another example of changes in port governance, this one is from Rotterdam. Like Riga Port Authority, we used to be an administrative entity. We were founded in 1932. Originally, we used to be a municipal department, so the city was a regulator. But in 2004, the city believed that it was time to change this model, because at that time we were losing market share to ports such as Antwerp and Hamburg. Our revenues and profits were not really growing. They were basically just staying flat. So the city believed that the port needed to be more commercial, more business-minded. So to that end, in 2004, the Port Authority was converted into a corporate entity. Legally speaking, we are not different from a private Dutch company. We function under the same laws that apply to private Dutch companies. The only difference is that we are publicly owned. We have the city of Rotterdam with 70% of the shares in the company, and the Dutch state with 30% of the shares. In that way, actually, it's quite similar to Riga, where I understand that the city and the state are both part of the management of the port. the big change that came as a result of corporatization was that the relationship between the port and the city changed. The city was no longer a regulator, but a shareholder in the port. It had a more direct commercial interest in the performance of the port. Financially, corporatization also was a good move. Since corporatization, our revenues have grown at an average rate of 5% per year. And because of this, because we are earning more money, we're also able to reinvest more in the port. Every year, the Port Authority invests approximately 200 million euros in the port. And of course, the investments we make also help make the port more attractive for private companies. Okay. Now, this morning I was very glad to see the presentations about the history of the port of Riga. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our own history. We started in the center of the city here, back in the 1400s. And for the first 400 years, the port stayed there in the city center. Didn't need much space. You know, we're talking vessels of 30 meters, maybe. They don't need deep water. It was more important to be close to the market. So it stayed. Then in the 19th century, the port moved to the south side of the river, and for about 100 years it stayed there. These two areas are no longer port area. This is now completely urbanized. Offices, housing, commercial space. Then came the 20th century. In the 1920s, before the Second World War, these areas were developed. And what you can see here is that the plots of land get bigger plots of land. Why? Well, essentially, you see the start of our petrochemical industry. The first refinery started here in the 1930s. Then, after the war, came further development. Again, you see big plots. Also petrochemical, at this time the petrochemical industry was still the main driver. Then came the 1960s. This is the Europort area, and you see it's even bigger than the previous zones. Also here, the driver here was the development of the petrochemical industry. Most of this area are still chemical plants, refineries, power plants. Then we ran out of space. The original coastline of the Netherlands was here. This is where it originally was. But the port still needed to grow. So what did we do? We developed Maasvlakte 1 in the 1970s. And here we actually made a little mistake in that we built everything at once, expecting that this area would be for steel industries, coal, iron ore. In reality, the steel industries never came. And much of this area sat empty. It took about 15, 20 years to fill up this area. So for a long time, much of the area was empty, even though we had already invested in that land. By the 1990s, this was pretty much filled, and then we started discussion about the next expansion of the port. So then we developed Maasvlakte 2. This is the white area here. We learned from our mistake there, and rather than building everything at once, we built a sea defense first, creating a big body of water, flexible body of water, where we could then create infrastructure on demand. We now have 2 container terminals here. These were only developed once we had contracts with clients. And finally, in 2014, we acquired the Port of Dordrecht here. So this is now this is how we have evolved. And again, what I like to point out, in the past, small plots, small vessels, you didn't need deep water. But as vessels became bigger, as industry came, as volumes increased, we had to move towards the sea, towards deeper water. Now, I'm going to highlight what we have done with older parts of the port. As you can see, the city center, we no longer have port activities. And there are two parts of the port, these two areas here, which we are converting for new activities. These areas are small. The water is not very deep. It's maybe 12 meters depth. Not very attractive for the large container vessels which now sail the seas. So we are developing what's called the Makers District, which consists of RDM and M4H. This is what it looks. This is an aerial view of the two areas. This used to be an old shipyard. I'll come back to this a bit later. And these two areas are being redeveloped not entirely by ourselves. This is actually in partnership with the municipality. In Rotterdam, we like to say that the port is an ecosystem which is an important economic engine. The Port of Rotterdam directly and indirectly employs almost 200,000 people and contributes about 3% of the Dutch GDP. So it's a very important economic engine, but it's also an ecosystem. There are many pieces to it, many players. And for this ecosystem to function properly, all the parts have to work together well. What is the vision for the Makers District? Well, basically, what we are trying, our long-term vision is to still be Europe's premier industrial cluster. We still want to be a leading industrial cluster 20, 30 years from now. And we realize that maybe some of the big industries like refineries will disappear, but we are now looking, what are the new industries? So the vision behind Makers District is to attract new innovative industries and supporting services, create employment for the population of Rotterdam, create an open, innovative environment, a combination of companies and educational institutions. Because the port is more, more and more you're seeing that ports require skilled labor. It's no longer just about carrying heavy bags in and out of a ship or driving cranes. It's now about, in Rotterdam, we now have container terminals that are completely automated. There are no people on the container yard. It's all machines operating independently. So you need programmers. You need people with high-level technical skills. We also want the Makers District to be a testing ground for new circular economy, recycling of older materials, and of course create a more attractive urban space. There are three sectors that we are focusing on. Robotization. So robotics makes manufacturing close to markets more viable in Europe. So trying to attract some of the manufacturing activities that are happening in, say, China, trying to bring them back to Europe with robotics. New materials. Sciences are making a circular, digitized economy possible, and therefore able to develop more sustainable industrial segment. And also new manufacturing techniques like 3D printing. We are already testing 3D printing in Rotterdam, and what we want to do in this Makers District is bring it from being used only for prototypes to a broader application. At this moment in time, 3D printing is really only being used to make prototypes, but we believe that the future will be trying to broaden the application of this technology in Europe. I'm going to talk briefly about the two parts of this Makers District. The first is RDM. RDM used to be one of the biggest shipyards in the Netherlands. This is a picture in 1946. This is today. You can see that all the ships are gone. This has now been converted into a space. There's a university here. This is a space for startup companies, convention center. We've also kept the older architecture here of the shipyard, again, also as a meeting space. But we have not done this alone. This is a joint, again, the port is an ecosystem. And RDM has been developed in partnership with 2 universities in Rotterdam. And we have created this concept of RDM, which includes a center of expertise, event center, training plant, maker space, a new space for startup companies, and also developing new technologies. And I see that I need to hurry up. Just some pictures, 3D printing of a ship propeller, education and robotics. Here, these gentlemen are manufacturing a drone to collect plastic from the water. And we have the same idea for M4H. This is currently a port area used for juice and fruits, but this cargo is increasingly being put in containers. So we plan to redevelop, it's already being redeveloped along the same lines as RDM. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks.